To order. Welcome to meeting number 77 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. I will start with a few reminders. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. Just so you are aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. Screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, April 17, 2023, the committee resumed its study of animal biosecurity preparedness. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first panel.
Canadian Federation of Agriculture joining us in the room, Pierre Lampron, who is the second vice president. Welcome, Mr. Lampron. No stranger to this committee. It's great to have you here. And I think joining us by teleconference, we have Brody Berrigan, who is Director of Government Relations and Farm Policy. Avec le Réseau Canadien pour la Santé de l'Enfant.
With the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, Dr. Damien Joly, Chief Executive Officer.
The co-owner and operator. I understand we're having just a little bit of technical difficulties, but I know our technical teams are working with you to try to get your headset in order for translation. But colleagues will navigate that as we go, and hopefully we can make it work. So we're going to allow for 5 minutes for opening statements. We are a little bit delayed, so I'll try to keep it compressed. But I'm going to start with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Donc, Monsieur Lampron, 5 minutes. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Lampron, 5 minutes. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Pierre Lampron. I am the second vice president of Canadian Federation of Agriculture. We have met before on Bill C-275. And the CFA is Canada's largest general farm organization. We represent over 190,000 farmers and farm families across Canada. These men and women are at the heart of the Canadian agri-food system, generating $134.9 billion of Canada's gross domestic product. I myself am a dairy farmer. Therefore, I fully appreciate the critical importance of animal emergency preparedness and ensuring strong biosecurity measures are in place to protect our animals, our livelihoods as farmers, as well as our economy. Generally speaking, from our perspective, the most effective strategy to deal with biosecurity threats is prevention. Here in Canada, across all livestock sectors, farmers have put strict biosecurity protocols in place to ensure the health and safety of their animals. I am most familiar with the National Standard on Biosecurity for Canadian Dairy Farms, which was developed by the Dairy Farmers of Canada working with the CFIA. The National Standard focuses on 4 biosecurity control areas that result in a significant reduction in disease and humans' food safety risks. So, these include restricting visitors' access to animals, ensuring the farm is well-maintained, clean, and sanitary, ensuring that there is a herd health plan in place that includes responding proactively to disease risk and keeping new animals separate from existing animals until they represent no disease risk. On top of that, the dairy sector has integrated biosecurity into its ProAction certification program, which offers proof to customers that the sector is ensuring quality and safety in milk, animal health and welfare, as well as environmental stewardship. Every livestock commodity has their own biosecurity standards. Another important facet of this issue is facilitating communication and coordination nationally and across other jurisdictions. Animal diseases don't recognize borders. We're all better served by fostering clear communication and sharing best practices. In Canada, we have seen good progress in establishing collaborative protocols that clearly define critical tasks and delineate responsibilities to ensure a coordinated and timely response. While this work has been underway in one fashion or another for some time, we have seen recent progress made through the Animal Health Emergency Management Project, overseen by Animal Health Canada, which supports the collaborative development of resources to minimize the impacts of disease. Animal Health Canada is a national organization bringing together industry, federal, provincial, and territorial governments to provide collaborative guidance on animal health and welfare systems in Canada. The success of this model is that it enables a comprehensive approach jointly developed by industry and government, supporting increased awareness, response capacity, and confidence through the developments of protocols supported by clear guidance and training. The last point I want to touch on is international trade. The integrated nature of our markets has long made clear the importance of animal health and animal biosecurity as key priorities. An outbreak of an infectious disease in any sector has disastrous effects, including but not limited to closing our borders to trade, lost trade opportunities, and increases in production costs. That's one of the reasons why traceability systems are absolutely critical to facilitate both efficiency and stable growth. These systems need to be developed through extensive industry leadership and engagement and be supported with education and outreach. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr. Lampron. That was perfect. Now on to Mr. Joly for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much for this invitation to speak today. We really appreciate this opportunity, and we really hope we're going to be of some use today. So my name is Dr. Damien Joly. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm grateful to be a guest on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I myself live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation on Vancouver Island. So the focus of my presentation today is on disease threats that are shared between domestic animals and wildlife. I hope to make the case that our domestic animals share many diseases with wildlife, and that surveillance for diseases in wildlife is a critical component of animal biosecurity. For example, there are 31 federally listed as reportable diseases in Canada. These diseases include foot-and-mouth disease, African swine fever, and avian influenza, and 28 other diseases. So of these 31 reportable diseases, 22 can or potentially can infect wildlife in Canada. So that's 70% of federally reportable diseases that can pass between wildlife and domestic animals. Clearly, wildlife are an important part of the biosecurity equation. To further make this point, consider the current episodic of avian influenza, of high pathogenic avian influenza in Canada. From the first cases in November and December of 2021 in Newfoundland until the end of September of 2023, 7.7 million birds, domestic birds, on facilities in Canada have been impacted from across about 320 facilities across the country in all provinces but for PEI. This is a virus that was introduced to Canada from wild birds. There's no way of really knowing how many wild birds or wild mammals have died of this virus in Canada, but we know it numbers in the many thousands of animals. We do know that the virus has been isolated from over 90 species of wild birds in Canada and 14 wild mammals, including red foxes, skunks, several marine mammals, and black bears. Highly pathogenic avian influenza illustrates my point. This virus is quite capable of jumping back and forth between wildlife and domestic animals, and avian influenza isn't the only pathogen we're worried about. It's this fact that makes surveillance for diseases in wildlife so important to protecting the health of Canadians and our animals. This is what we do at the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. We are a collaboration of the 5 vet schools in Canada, as well as the BC Animal Health Centre, run by the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food. With the support of our federal, provincial, and territorial partners, such as Environment and Climate Change Canada, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Parks Canada, and the Public Health Agency of Canada, for over 30 years, we've done our best to monitor the health of wildlife populations across Canada to identify, assess, and mitigate disease risks. For example, in fiscal year 22-23, we conducted disease investigations on over 8,000 wild animals from across Canada, testing for a battery of diseases, including avian influenza, bovine tuberculosis, and Newcastle disease. For much of Canada, if a wild animal is found dead and reported, it usually ends up at one of our labs. In collaboration with our federal, provincial, and territorial partners, we form an essential component of Canada's wildlife health surveillance system. Our strength results from this collaborative and decentralized approach. By working together, we can confront issues that are bigger issues than any one of us could attack alone. By working locally and regionally, we can provide local and regional solutions to local and regional problems, and yet have national coordination. So when you give a presentation, you always want the audience to come away with something, right? Something they can remember. If there's one thing I hope you remember walking out of this talk, is that it's really important to conduct surveillance of wild populations if we want to maintain biosecurity in Canada. We're talking about the same diseases here, and these diseases really don't care which side of the fence an animal is on. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joly. Appreciate you being here and appreciate your testimony. We're going to turn it over to Ms. Lockwood. I know that you rebooted your computer and you've worked on the technical side, so over to you for up to 5 minutes. You're just on mute there. Sorry about that. There you go.
Thank you for having me today, and I hope the technical issues are okay. I believe it's on the translation, so I will do my best to speak slowly and clearly. I just wanted to acknowledge as well that I'm on the territories of the Hulkaminam speaking
I'll just have to stop you.
Island.
I apologize, Ms. Lockwood. I'm being told by one of our members that there isn't translation.
Okay.
So let me just pause for a second here. I'll stop the clock, just 1 second. Do you have, Ms. Lockwood, do you have at least your opening remarks, perhaps even in digital copy, or were you just going to cuff it today and for us, because we might be able to help you in a little bit of that regard?
All right. I was just planning on cuffing it. I
Okay.
do have some notes, but they're
No,
minimal.
understood. We're having trouble. Maybe we'll try one more time, but the interpreters are, I don't know what the issue may be. I don't suspect it's with you. It could just be a technical bit, and we can always work to try to have you come back or find another way to get your evidence. But I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll just try one more time and see if we can make this work. Thank you.
All right. So my name is Cami Lockwood, and I'm a farmer on Vancouver Island. My husband and myself farm about 5 acres of land, and we have 6,000 laying hens. So we're, of course, part of Canada's supply managed system. And we came to that through the new producer program in 2015. So I'm hoping I can provide you some perspective of what biosecurity looks like on the ground for us.
Ms. Lockwood, I'll stop. I think the interpreters are asking if you could just move up your mic just slightly, a little bit closer, I guess, to your mouth. Maybe we'll try that. And I think it was working up until then, so sorry about this interruption.
No worries. Is this a bit better, hopefully? Okay.
You go ahead.
All right. So biosecurity on our farm, seeing especially as we have a number of different animals, we are very often changing our boots, using boot dips, and we have secured access zones and locks, as well as a really robust rodent control program and pest control programs. But being very aware of the biosecurity risks and having lived through the AI crisis of 2023 and 2022, we have learned a lot, and we take it very seriously, so much so that it actually affects our children's pet choices as well, as we don't allow budgies or parrots in the house. It's a major concern for us. Certainly, the impacts of the avian influenza last year are quite extensive. For ourselves, we found that it was a lot of extra work going through all the regular biosecurity procedures, as well as we were under higher media scrutiny as the event was unfolding. Of course, it died down from the media side as it went on. We also had a significant amount of difficulty in constantly educating people around us. We come from a very agricultural area with a lot of backyard flocks. So my husband and I were often having conversations with people that we knew or people that we didn't even know about their responsibilities as chicken owners. For the BC industry, of course, the egg supply dipped down so much that I know a lot of the grading staff had to be laid off, a lot of the truck drivers. So it definitely had some major impacts on jobs in the larger sector. There's definitely strain on all aspects of the supply chain. It's difficult to replace a flock. Usually we plan flocks about 3 years out to know how many birds we're going to need and allow the time for them to be grown properly. And also, I really need to mention that there's deep impacts on farmer mental health, especially in the Lower Mainland area. It's such a huge food producing area, and the Lower Mainland farmers had gone through COVID and then through the heat domes and then the floods of 2022 and then straight into the AI outbreak. And it's been very difficult for them to continue to rebuild. So moving forward, I always like to look at what can be done to change. And I'd like for you to consider hearing from the Emergency Operations Committee here in BC. They did a phenomenal job of liaising between the poultry boards, producers, and the CFIA. Also, improved relationships between the CFIA and farmers. There was I think a lot of tension just between farmers and government there in trying to manage the disease and manage the outbreaks. So definitely having some training for CFIA staff in working with farmers, but also I think for farmers in working with CFIA. It was a lot of very practical things that came up that farmers and CFIA staff just took a very different perspective on. That's caused a lot of tension in the industry. So I think moving forward, not villainizing farmers who have endured an outbreak, ensuring a continuity for farmers. So if they have a case manager, that the case manager just isn't reassigned the next day. And being quick with funding and making the funding more comprehensive for farmers who have endured loss. And also considering alternatives for depopulating a flock when farmers were having to wait for the CFIA to come and take care of the depopulation. We were seeing flocks that still were there for 5 to 7 days after they'd been diagnosed. And that's a very difficult position for farmers as you have to firstly keep those birds alive, and all the feed is very expensive to do so. And it also increases spread if that's the case. So considering different alternatives. And I think in terms of AI and moving forward, animal improvements are really, really important. So of course, we're essentially monocropping with hens. So having different strains of breeds and different varieties would be helpful. So encouraging some breeders. in that direction, and allowing for vaccines. It's my understanding that Canada has just decided to follow in the steps of the United States in terms of vaccine regulations, and I believe that some of the vaccine regulations in America are more based on different trade regulations. So if Canada is able to come up with our own decisions there to allow for more robust vaccines, that would also be very helpful for farmers.
Ms.
And
Lockwood,
certainly in the event of
I apologize. We're getting close to time in the 5 minutes. I know we had to delay you a little bit. If you want to just wrap up quickly, and then we'll get to questions.
All right. I'd also like to the community relationships improvements and just having stronger education for backyard flocks. That's something that we saw a lot during this event. It was spread through backyard flocks, and encouraging wild bird mortality reporting based on what some of your other witnesses have said, and also discouraging animal activists breaking and entering properties. That's a huge biosecurity threat for all of us. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lockwood. Yeah, we were just studying that legislation, but I'm going to get to questions. We're going to turn it over to Mr. Barlow for up to 6 minutes. Over to you, Mr. Barlow.
Interesting last comment there from Ms. Lockwood. Appreciated that. Ms. Lockwood, did you have, your flock tested positive for AFI during the outbreak in 2023 or 2022?
No, we did not.
That is very good. I'm glad to hear that. I just wanted to make from what your comments were. But just on that, maybe your assessment, or you were mentioning maybe other opportunities or alternatives for depopulation, and you had mentioned the mental health impact this has on producers who are having to euthanize entire flocks. And we were hearing similar stories where if a case of AFI was found on farm, CFI is supposed to be there within 48 hours. In many cases, it was days, if not weeks, putting a lot of stress and mental health on the producer with those birds. What would be some alternatives to depopulating? Have you spoken with your other producers in terms of maybe giving the farmer the authority to depopulate in some way rather than having to wait for CFIA?
Yes, there are different ways to manage it. I know there's a lot of issues around sourcing the CO2 material to be able to depopulate a full barn. But certainly the electric shock truck is mobile and is capable of doing that. It does require people to be in the barns handling all the hens during that time. And those would also be other favorable methods of depopulation.
Right. And you made a good point there, where we were also hearing that CFIA did not have sufficient stores of CO2 on hand. And maybe I'll ask this to you as well as Mr. Lampron and Mr. Berrigan from CFA. Has that been resolved? It seems to me we're talking about biosecurity preparedness and ensuring that CFIA has the resources on hand to address these types of outbreaks when they occur would be priority number one. Is there any information in terms of CFIA improving that situation? Maybe I'll go to Mr. Lampron, might have a larger view of this.
I'm sorry, I would pass the mic to Brody here. I don't really have much experience in that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Barlow. It's a good one. I don't have a direct line of sight in terms of the resource reallocation within CFA for this specific issue. My understanding is that the delays were substantial in a few instances, but not across the board. So in some cases, it can take quite a while. But my understanding is that's more the exception than the rule. Having said that, I think it's an important question around the overall health and well-being of animals. Nobody wants to, I'm sure Kemi would say the same thing, nobody wants to see their livestock suffering. So we need to ensure that whether it's through CFIA or if producers are involved in that process, that their right information and tools are in their hands so that they can do it effectively, efficiently, and humanely.
Thank you very much. Now, Ms. Lockwood.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just got a little bit of time left here, so I'm just going to go to my last question. You had mentioned the importance of preventing, unwanted guests coming on your farm, protesters. We had just passed Bill 275 in this committee, which will put substantial fines on people who would come onto private property and protest on your farm or in your barn. Do you think that's an important tool to have those deterrents to protect the biosecurity and the mental health of you as a producer?
Absolutely. I know it's been frustrating for the pork farm in the Lower Mainland. They had a busload come, I think, in 2019 of trespassers who went directly into their barn. And it's always a concern for us as producers.
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? 9 seconds. 90. Okay. Mr. Berrigan, again to you and CFA. How important is a tool such as 275 to help ensure the biosecurity protection and the protection of our food supply on Canadian farms, and to see this get third reading and royal assent? Be close, but we're not there yet. How important of a tool is this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As you would have heard us say a few weeks ago when we testified before this committee on that bill, it is extremely important for our members, something that we've heard about on a regular basis. We need to be putting resources into supporting biosecurity on farm. We need to support the mental health of farmers. There are significant trade implications associated with biosecurity, and we are very much so in support of that bill and hope to see it pass as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Berrigan. Thank you, Mr. Barlow. That's at time. I'll now turn it over to Ms. Taylor-Roy. Over to you.
Mr. Chair, I'm just going to take a couple minutes to just to ask some questions or just to make a statement with regards to the availability of CO2. And I want to thank Ms. Lockwood for appearing before this committee. And I know many of her colleagues in BC would have had some issues with access to CO2 within the first 72 hours. But I did meet with Mark Siemens, who's the president of BC Poultry Association, and the BC Turkey Marketing Board, BC Chicken Marketing Board, BC Broiler Hatching Eggs Commission, and the BC Eggs Marketing Board back in January, and we agreed, CFIA, I know the regional director was out there meeting just to see how we could improve things. And I know AAFC was had found a supplier in Alberta who were bringing CO2 and even storing CO2 at their facilities because broilers are so close by in your area, as you would know. And I'm thankful to hear that you haven't been impacted. Obviously, you're doing the right thing and implementing the right measures, but I just didn't want to leave this committee with the impression that there's still a lack of access of CO2, as I know that issue had been solved, and it was solved. It was solved at the time when I was there in January, but I know we always can be built. Better can always be possible, and that's the agreement that I know CFIA had done to continue working together. And you've made some comments about having a better interaction with CFIA employees and farmers, and I think those are great comments for this committee. And I want to thank you for you to appear before this committee, but for your comments as well. Over to you, Ms. Roy. Taylor Roy.
Thank you.
I forgot the Taylor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And yes, I wanted to just follow up with the issue of the backyard flocks that you were talking about, Ms. Lockwood. You mentioned that disease had been transmitted through those backyard flocks. Is that correct?
Yes.
But it never came onto your farm. You never had a problem with it?
No. So I'm actually on Vancouver Island. So we are isolated here, but we had a number of cases of high-path AI due to backyard flocks. So there was a number in very small and very remote communities that came up.
Okay, great, thank you. And have you ever heard or had any heard of or had any of the avian influenza passed on to your flocks or others that you've heard of from trespassers?
No, not from trespassers. But if you consider what we go through to just enter our barn on a daily basis, for ourselves, we change our boots at the front of the barn and we wear our barn slippers. And then from our ante-room, we have access to 2 different flocks and we have separate boot changes for each flock. as well as a separate pair of coveralls. And we wash our hands regularly between.
Right. So you adhere to very high biosecurity measures, but you've never had an instance or heard of an instance when a trespasser has actually brought any of these diseases into the farm?
No, I haven't heard of an instance like that.
Okay.
But it can be very difficult to know how you contracted avian influenza as well.
Of course. And it sounds like, I wanted to go to Mr. Joly for a minute. It sounds like a lot of the avian influenza does come from wild birds. How do you think that the research, the work you're doing in coordination with the provinces, because I know they have jurisdiction over a lot of this, is helping to curb that?
So that's an excellent question. I'm just making sure this is on. Thank you very much for that question. So we work really closely with all of the provinces and the territories, and our role is a support role. Ultimately, we all know there's a constitutional mandate for provinces and the federal government and Indigenous nations for wildlife and wildlife health. So we work, the support we provide is really tailored to what's needed. So for example, in British Columbia, British Columbia has this very active OWN program. So we're involved to a lesser degree in British Columbia because of the way it's put together. But across the country, our work allows essentially, I don't want to say real-time early warning, but it allows early warning because we are going to see avian influenza, high-path avian influenza in wild birds before they show up in farms. We'll see birds dying out in the landscape. And so by identifying them on the landscape, we can alert the authorities and alert farms in a particular area to say, hey, avian influenza is in this area. You should always make the assumption it's there, but actually knowing it's in the region is, I think, helpful because it's really hard to maintain that super high level biosecurity all the time. Now, I'm not a farmer, but I understand it's very difficult and it's expensive, and maintaining that high level of biosecurity and at such a high level all the time is very difficult. So, but if you know that the virus is in the region, then you can adjust as necessary. So I think just even that simple fact of knowing where the virus is helps.
Great, thanks. And do you work with CFIA when you detect an outbreak as well?
Absolutely. So the way the system works is we'll get a call, a dead animal, a dead goose, or a dead skunk will be reported. It'll come to one of our labs, and we'll do the preliminary screening test, and then we send samples to the lab in Winnipeg for confirmation. We can't actually say that's high-path avian influenza. That's CFIA's role. So we work very closely with CFIA on an ongoing basis.
We'll have to leave it at that, Ms. Taylor-Roy. Thank you so much. Maintenant, M. Parent pour 6 minutes. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci d'abord aux témoins d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. On apprécie beaucoup votre disponibilité. Monsieur Lampron, je vais aller avec vous. Vous avez parlé de l'importance d'un système de traçabilité dans votre introduction. Est-ce que vous pensez que les mesures qu'on a, là, vous connaissez mieux l'industrie laitière que d'autres, mais de votre connaissance, là, en général, est-ce que nos mesures de traçabilité sont suffisantes au Québec et au Canada? Est-ce qu'il y a des améliorations à apporter là-dessus?
Ben, je dirais que oui, parce que c'est quand même, on a fait beaucoup de travail dans les dernières années, surtout la production bovine. C'est sûr qu'on a le laitier et bovin qui sont séparés, un petit peu la réglementation, mais oui, il y a beaucoup. Faut quand même reconnaître le travail qui a été fait.
Pardon, excusez, M. Parent, désolé.
I'm sorry, Mr. Parent, there's some overlap. Perhaps there's a problem. The English is on the French is on the English. The interpreter has corrected the problem.
Je vais continuer.
So I'm going to continue speaking in French. Can those who are listening to the English hear the English? Yes? Good. All right, go ahead, Mr. Perron. All right, thank you. Now you know what I go through. All right, so go ahead. I was asking you if you feel that we have enough measures, not just in the dairy industry, but generally speaking, in terms of traceability. Well, I think we need to acknowledge all the work that has been done. Much has been done, and we have to continue on that track. We have to work collaboratively with the producers, and they have done a lot of work, and the government has to put enough traceability measures in place. Thank you very much. Would you have any specific recommendations to make to the committee? Or do you think we should just do more of what we're already doing? I would say yes, we need to do more of what we're already doing. My next question is this. I'm just going to follow along on traceability. Now, I know that you've worked a lot on neighboring markets. And I would say that you're in a good position to tell me more about this. If you think that we could do more processing in the regions with better support from the government, that would improve safety and security because there would be less transportation over long distances. Because, we won't be using, say, animals from Pennsylvania and processing them here. Or what if we had more processing happening closer to where the animals are raised? Well, yes, I think that would be an improvement. And it brings me back to your question on traceability. It helps with traceability. And for trade, if we want to be able to go from the farm to the table, well, we have our traceability for biosecurity. And I think in terms of trade, it would be important to know where the animal is coming from, where it's being raised, and there's considerable improvement that could be made. And also that would help with developing regional economies. So when you say something's lacking, let me ask this. Say an animal is killed and then sent off. Are you saying there's no more traceability once it goes far away? Well, there's traceability up until the slaughterhouse. And after that, some things are done voluntarily, but there is less and less regulation applying to that portion leading up to the consumer. So perhaps what we could do is have shorter circuits and also develop a local economy. So we wouldn't necessarily have to have these longer circuits, longer chains, for example, and large processors.
Agricole est atteinte par une maladie. On a entendu plusieurs.
So we heard many witnesses speak to us about the CFIA, but they did speak to delays, and the delays seem to be caused by resources. Would you have anything to say to that? Well, I think there's goodwill, certainly. Obviously, resources are needed, whether that be at the border or whether that be when we have to deal with outbreaks. As someone said earlier on, there's already better collaboration, yes, between the provinces and the federal, but resources are required, whether it has to do with vaccinations or otherwise. So, vaccines are very important as well. Would you say that there's enough support for vaccine development? Well, I think much progress has been made, but there's a lot of room for progress and for improvement. We need vaccine banks. So, yes, a step has been made in the right direction, but more can be done. And let's look at diseases that threat, for example, African swine fever or influenza, avian influenza. Do you think that we have enough to be able to deal with a crisis, or are there flaws in vaccine availability? Well, biosecurity is so important because we don't want this to happen. We don't want wild animals to infect our herds. So we always have to be ready. Yeah. So from what I understand, you're saying we need more resources, we need more vaccines, and we're not necessarily ready for a crisis. Yes, I think I could agree with that. Thank you very much. Mr. McGregor, you have 6 minutes.
To thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Lockwood, I'd like to start with you. Welcome back to our committee. It's wonderful to see you here and to providing that important perspective from Vancouver Island. I really appreciated how you were talking about how relations between farmers and the CFIA, that there's room for improvement there. And I appreciate also in your opening statement how you detailed, the multiple crises that farmers, particularly in British Columbia, have gone through with, the heat dome, with the atmospheric river, followed by avian influenza. And it just seems like the hits keep on coming. You've had to do a lot of learning as you've been in the middle of those crises, and it may not have directly impacted your farm, but that danger, I think, was always there, hanging over your head like a sword of Damocles. We know that other outbreaks, we don't even have the names for them yet, but it's not a question of if, but when. And so I guess what I'd like to know from you is, what would you appreciate as a farmer from the CFIA in being proactive? Would you prefer more bulletins, more up-to-date awareness of what potential threats are? Is there anything that you can add in that specific area? Because I believe that, preparedness is the key, and we want to equip our farmers to be ready for any eventuality that might come and affect our regions.
I think actually more just a good working relationship and understanding between the two groups. Farmers are very practical and just jump in and get things done. And it seems the CFIA was a little bit more following the rules to the book, to the letter. And that had some major implications, and it was kind of the difference between the two that as I said, seemed to rub people the wrong way on both sides. So definitely having some more information would be very helpful, and really truly understanding the process of what happens when there is an AI outbreak on a farm, because even for ourselves, we're not 100% sure of who to call. We know we'd start somewhere, and then we'd kind of work down the list of how to notify people. And also retesting as well, having enough testing facilities. I do know that the Lower Mainland lab was severely affected by the floods, and that it impacted our salmonella testing for 2 years after the event. So having regular testing and also being able to retest a flock that isn't showing any symptoms. That way we're not accidentally or intentionally depopulating healthy flocks, right? So I think a few things like that would go a long way with working with the CFIA. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Jolly, I'd like to turn to you. I think we've taken away the message that surveillance of wild populations is critical. I guess, have you noticed, or have any of your colleagues noticed that, with climate change and how it is severely impacting the Northern Hemisphere in some pretty profound ways, and in some of those unintended consequences or unintended impacts are different migration patterns of species that we just they're not native to our areas. Is that having any kind of impact in disease spread? Are you noticing any patterns, something that we as a committee or the federal government should just kind of keep its eye on with a changing climate and different species that may be coming as a result of that?
So, absolutely, and thank you for the question. So, science is difficult, right? I'm not able to actually draw a line and say, well, if it weren't for climate change, we wouldn't see this disease. But we certainly are seeing different migration patterns. And even the example of avian influenza, high-path avian influenza has been in Asia since 2005, 2006, this H5N1 strain. And it's only now in the last 2 years showed up. And it not only came over the Atlantic, but it also came over the Pacific. So 15 years, nothing, 20 years, nothing, and then we have it jump both oceans twice in 1 year. So one could infer that climate change is definitely having a risk. And theoretically, we know, we can predict that climate change will continue to have impacts on the spread of disease and potentially bring new pathogens that we haven't seen before. For example, malaria could come back to Canada, for example, as temperatures warm, and so on and so forth. So very much so.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you very much. And then just a final question to the CFA. Good to see you here, Mr. Lemperel. We have had a lot of conversation for this committee on the voluntary biosecurity guidelines, and we have seen that some of the worst outbreaks have happened on farms and have been transmitted by people who are authorized to be on one farm, and they've carried it accidentally to another one. I'm just wondering, when we have these kind of outbreaks and they're the result of a biosecurity measures not being enforced, if that's what the investigation results in, do you think there might be a stronger role for the federal government to get involved in the voluntary aspect of these biosecurity guidelines? I mean, if we really want to make sure that we're nailing these down before they become full-blown crises.
So unfortunately, you're going to have to take note of that, Mr. Lampron, because Mr. McGregor tried
Right
to
at
roll
the
the
time.
book and got right to 6 minutes on his question, and then but he's got 2.5 minutes coming up, and I'll turn that over to you at that time. Mr. Steinley, you're going to go first, but we only have 5 minutes for you, so use it wisely.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Mr. Chair, and that good, solid advice. I do have one question. It's for Mr. Berrigan. This committee is going to be studying animal transport regulations and the use of ELDs in the upcoming study. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to biodiversity, do you think the government has kind of inadvertently allowed some more intermingling of animals? For example, if someone just gets to not quite to their destination, they have to unload and then load back up livestock at a facility. Could that have an adverse effect on some of the biosecurity concerns we have around animals? Because if we would look at maybe changing some of the animal transport regulations, they may not have to unload and load, and they could get to their point of destination within the desired timeline. And is that something that we've thought about, or CFA has thought about? And is there a way that we can make that so that the animals wouldn't have to be loaded and unloaded as much as they are now under these new regs?
Thank you for the question. And yes, we have certainly put a lot of thought into this issue, and it is something that's very concerning for our members. I think that, as you know, a driver can't, at least the way I understand it, can't drive more than 13 hours or after having been on duty for 14 hours. And the ELD, electronic logging device, will automatically begin calculating a driver's hours of service as soon as the truck reaches approximately 6 kilometers an hour, which doesn't always align with when the animals are actually loaded on the truck. And so that can have some unintended and adverse consequences, both from an animal welfare perspective and also from a biosecurity perspective, because as you said, there are these commingling, these rest stops where animals can commingle, they can spread disease. And so I don't think that was ever anyone's intended, I'm sure it wasn't anyone's ever intended effect or impact, but it's something that we need to look at. And so one of the things that we would recommend is actually looking at better alignment, closer alignment with the U.S. regulations in this case, especially since there's so much cross-border traffic between Canada and the U.S.
Yeah, no, I was just going to put that on the record. It's something where they have about a 150-mile radius at their home and at their destination where it isn't considered logging hours. That was something that would be really beneficial here in Canada. I'll turn it over to Mr. Lahu.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Question for Mr. Lampron or Mr. Berrigan. You mentioned international trade, which means that there's a lot of crossing at the borders, and we know that our border with the United States is very large. Do you have any information with the CFIA's capacity with border security agencies to make sure that they do all of the necessary surveillance at the borders? Well, we've been asking for it for a long time, and I think that they have goodwill. They want to do the work, but they need more resources. They need more knowledge. They need more training. They really need to know what they're looking for. So indeed, you agree. Yes, they're doing what they can, but they do need additional resources, whether it's more vets, when there are trucks arriving at the border or anything else. So I understand that there is an issue there. With regards to infectious diseases, we talked a lot about avian influenza during this meeting, but there are other diseases such as foot and mouth disease. But do you know anything? Do you have any information with regards to how much surveillance there is? Well, with pork farms, when there is an infection in one hog, then we stop production entirely, and it's billions of dollars that in production in 77 countries can be stopped. So nobody wants this to happen, But the question on biosecurity is to make sure that we do have the right resources at the right time. Yes, indeed, that's very important. Do I still have time left, Mr. Chair? Unfortunately, that's time. Just a few seconds. I trust that you will be able to share your time with the committee, and your time is up. You're putting words in my mouth, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lewis, now for 5 minutes.
All the witnesses for appearing. Maybe I would start with Dr. Jolie from the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. I appreciate you've reported in the past that we are likely to see increases in cases as climate change contributes more to spreads of diseases. You mentioned that's previously in reports, and then today you're talking about different migration patterns. It sounded like you were inferring that by air, but it can also probably be by land. Is that correct? Okay.
Absolutely.
From the Ontario Association of Anglers and Hunters, they're seeing cases, I believe, they're looking into EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease, a viral disease that affects white-tailed deer. And I know also if you reported AHD in BC. You've also mentioned that early detection is crucial for identifying these new and emerging diseases and threats, and that the important role that hunters can actually play cannot be overstated. There's many hunters in my riding. What role would hunters have in detecting an EHD or AHD across the country? What education is being done, and how can we improve on that?
Thank you for the question. So I just want to illustrate or to reiterate how important hunters are. These are people who are on the land who know what's normal. And in any kind of disease situation, unless you know what's normal, you can't detect the abnormal. So that integration, that cooperation with hunters and Indigenous people, whoever else is on the land, is critical to what we do. We at the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative put a ton of effort into education for that very reason. And so, for example, we're working with the government of British Columbia right now to revise a very popular manual called Diseases You Can Get from Wildlife, which goes through in great detail the types of diseases and how to avoid getting those. So we're doing a refresh on that document right now. And our website, for example, is full of material intended for exactly people like hunters who are on the ground who can tell us when something is different, whether a lesion is something they've never seen before, and they have often decades of experience butchering animals and can say, well, this is weird. And that's that notification, that's the first time when somebody says, hey, there's something weird, and calls us, either calls us or sends us an email or uses our online reporting app or even a web tool a web app we're developing, or sorry, a mobile app that we're developing right now for reporting. That's crucial for us to be able to see what's going on the ground, because at the end of the day, there's very few of us in our labs in Saskatoon or in Guelph or in Saint-Hyacinthe. And so we need that cooperation with people who are on the land.
I appreciate you saying that. And so you're working with provinces, with all different levels of government, and also with the associations like the Anglers and Hunters. Okay, that's good. You also mentioned that diseases don't care what side of the fence the animal's on. I imagine that would apply to diseases don't care what side of the border animals are on. So with this maybe increased migration, are you cooperating with organizations similar to yours in the States to trade information and kind of predict where things go?
Absolutely. So the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey National Wildlife Health Center is a lab based in Madison, Wisconsin. And that's the U.S. sort of Center for Wildlife Disease Research. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture also has their own wildlife research. And we're talking with them all the time. For example, we co-host the World Organization for Animal Health Wildlife Collaborating Center with the USGS National Wildlife Health Center. A lot of words there. But the idea is we're on the phone with them all day. In fact, while I was sitting here, I got an email from Jonathan Sleeman, who's the former director of the USGS National Wildlife Health Center. So it's right in our name, right? We're a cooperative, and we want to collaborate with those people who share the same goal of healthy wildlife. So.
Okay, I have a minute left. Maybe I'd continue with you. No, in a good way. Invasive species. Are you studying insects as well? I'm specifically asking about the spotted lanternfly, which is in the States, and we're concerned about it migrating up.
So we do work with the Canadian Council of Invasive Species, for example. We've worked on feral swine and the SF file, but when it comes to insects, that's a little bit outside our bailiwick. So.
Appreciate that. 30 seconds, maybe, Monsieur Lampron. What can sectors do, different organizations do to help each other? Do they share information between commodities?
Oui, c'est sûr que les échanges de
Yes, of course, that there's an exchange of data, but we have to do more research in order to understand how the diseases come here, and we have to invest more in research. That is indeed very important.
I have more time. Thank you.
That is time. Now, Mr. Perron, for 2 minutes and a half. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Joly, I have some questions for you. You talked about surveillance, and you mentioned that there aren't enough of you. You need help, hunters, First Nations, and so on. I understand. What we seem to have consensus on today is that everyone's making efforts, but more resources are necessary for prevention. Do you think that you need more resources? Do you think that the CFIA has enough resources?
So thank you for the question. Je suis désolé. Je parle.
I'm sorry, I speak English.
Traduction. Okay.
We have interpreting.
One day. So, of course, we all need resources. Avian influenza is a perfect example of that. All of our labs went way beyond their capacity. People working late, working weekends. We ran out of money, and one of our labs actually had to stop testing for avian influenza because we simply didn't have enough money. So particularly when it comes to surge capacity, we just don't have the resources. And this is why we're working towards implementing a plan called the Pan-Canadian Approach to Wildlife Health. And this is essentially my mandate as a new CEO, is to fund this work. And this work is about strengthening capacity across the country for us to respond to wildlife health. It's about reducing disparity across the country. We have big gaps across the north, for example, and then even areas in southern Canada where we don't have good surveillance. We're trying to improve anticipation, trying to get ready to deal with the problems from 5 years from now. The problems of the future, get ready today. And ultimately, this plan is about improving efficiency. So we absolutely do need more resources to really solidify our work.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Lampron, pour terminer, réponse très rapide. Vous allez avoir à peu près 10 secondes pour me répondre.
Very quickly, you'll have 10 seconds to answer. The inspections at the borders, for example, what Mr. Lehoux was talking about, you talked about certain kinds of chicken that are entering the country, milk, there's a lack of resources. Are you afraid that there might be a disease entering through the border because we don't have enough resources, and if we had those resources, we could have detected it quickly? Yes, because we are scared because those diseases are always very scary, and we, of course, need as many resources as possible to fight against that. And, of course, I'm very happy for there to be collaboration with other countries. Thank you, Mr. Lampron and Mr. Joly and Mr. Perron. Now, Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So, Mr. Lampron, you've had a preview of the question I was going to ask, but just to make it clear, we have seen in CFI investigations where they have been looking at the cause of an outbreak on a farm that the biosecurity standards or guidelines on the farm were not followed. This has been documented, and I know like the guidelines are voluntary, but I guess for an organization like yours that represents thousands of farmers, we're only as strong as if everyone is following them, and so I guess what I'm wondering is there a role for the CFIA to get more involved in these voluntary guidelines? Or does the CFA have a process by which, after an investigation, you're getting more involved with the farm in question? I'm just thinking of, us trying to be as prepared as possible and trying to prevent these outbreaks. And if some farms are not, pulling their weight while others are, I think that could be a very real disservice to their neighbors. You see what I'm trying to get at here?
Oui, merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. We think that it's a lot better for us for things to not be mandatory. We need more data. People need to understand the potential consequences. That is what these organizations are trying to transmit as information. I think that raising awareness is more important and gaining more data. What we need to know is why people are acting this way. We have a better chance at making progress if we raise awareness. That's why, with regards to things being mandatory, sometimes people don't react very well to that. When people have the awareness, then they follow the biosecurity guidelines and measures. So they really need to be given the proper information.
You're in favor of remaining voluntary. Do you think then the CFIA could just play a little bit of a better role in promoting just what the guidelines are? Is there a gap in that? Like, ultimately, is there a recommendation we as a committee could make with respect to the CFIA's role on the voluntary guidelines? Does it need to be more active?
Oui, je suis d'accord avec ça. Ça fait partie d'avoir plus de ressources. Je pense que...
Indeed, I think there should be more resources. And everybody has their own responsibilities. The CFIA should be more known, and it's part of the general information that and general population that should be given.
Thank you, Mr. Lamperon. Folks, that brings us to the end of our first panel here this afternoon. But on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you, Mr. Joly, Mr. Lamperon, Ms. Lockwood, and Mr. Berrigan for jumping in and providing great testimony that I know will be helpful to the committee in its deliberations in the days ahead. So, colleagues, we're going to just take a brief pause to get ourselves set up for the second panel. But please don't go far because we are a little bit behind, and I want to try to make sure I can get you out of here just slightly after 5:30. Okay, we'll see you in a minute. Meeting suspended. maintenant souhaiter le bienvenue à
I'd like to now welcome our next witnesses for the second panel. First, as an individual, we have Dr. Jean-Pierre Vaillancourt, who is a full professor at the Université de Montréal. Welcome via video conference. Second, we have from the Canadian Animal Health Institute, Dr. Catherine Fileski. And finally, we also have with us the Fédération des producteurs d'œufs du Québec, Martin Pelletier, a consultant, appearing also by video conference. So you have 5 minutes each for your opening statement this afternoon, and we will begin with Dr. Vaillancourt. You have 5 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you very much. I'll be making my opening remarks in French, and I'm happy to answer questions in English or French. But I'm going to begin with a comment on backyard flocks. Someone raised that as being a problem, and yes, it can serve as a reservoir as pathogens, but there is research that shows that these backyard flocks are not necessarily important risk factor for avian influenza in terms of that link between a backyard flock and commercial farms. And in France, considerable research has been done, and it's actually shown that it's often the opposite, that in fact it's the commercial flocks that infect the backyard flocks. Now, I did send a page to you with the various points that I'd like to raise. I will only raise a few of the ones that are listed. The first is the need for standards in connection with construction of new farms, because oftentimes farms are within maybe 50, 60 meters of each other. But there shouldn't necessarily be new construction of farms that increases that density, regional density. For example, in Italy and Australia, they do have measures in place, and we do not have those measures with respect to distance. Now, we also need a centralized computer system that link provincial and federal laboratories. This is very important for the purposes of controlling these diseases, whether it be avian influenza, for example, whether it be African swine fever. So there has to be quick communication and rapid response, and that's why communication and centralized computer systems are so important. So we also do national databases in Canada, and these databases shouldn't necessarily be for the reportable diseases, but also for endemic diseases that we want to be able to restrict or eliminate. So they aren't necessarily reportable, but it would be important for Canada to have these data banks that are shared. Another point, oftentimes people have referred to the One Health issues. That can include many stakeholders, including public health. Public health have the best of intentions, but they're not necessarily familiar with all the animal industries. And that's a problem. If there's a pathogen that becomes zoonotic, and therefore public health has to be involved, there is a problem. Because oftentimes they lack the information that they need in order to make the right decisions. And so there needs to be more work on that. There has to be more communication, for example, between the Public Health Agency and the various sectors. There has to be better collaboration in the case of a zoonotic outbreak. There also has to be investment in technologies that facilitate compliance with biosecurity measures. That was raised in the first panel. There is much data that shows that there's a lack of compliance, and therefore we need investment in technologies to increase that compliance. I was able to get funding from the United States because the United States asked me to invest in that. The same project that I worked on here didn't even get beyond a letter of intent in Canada. So that's lacking. There have to be ways of facilitating compliance and increasing compliance, because human nature is such that people don't always follow the rules. There's also a lack of these non-quota. There's a lack, rather, of oversight of non-quota production. For example, ducks in the West are a problem. There are various colonies. There can be several species in the same place, so that has to be looked at as well. We have to look at that for various species, many species. But the main problem is that we have to increase biosecurity on the farm while taking a regional perspective. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Vaillancourt, and we'll now move on.
Please, over to you for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Catherine Faleski. I am both a licensed veterinarian and the current president and CEO of the Canadian Animal Health Institute, or the CAHI. CHI is the trade association that represents the developers, manufacturers, and distributors of animal pharmaceuticals, biologics, feed additives, veterinary health products, and animal pesticides. We are a national association serving as the trusted science-based voice of the Canadian animal health industry since our founding in 1968. And our full member companies are responsible for the sales of approximately 95% of Canada's animal health market. Biosecurity plays a critical role in animal health management by preventing and controlling the spread of diseases. And as a result, biosecurity preparedness is essential for the well-being of animals and Canadians alike. The availability of effective veterinary medicines, including vaccines, plays a key role in Canada's preparedness to deal with both foreign animal diseases and outbreaks of endemic diseases that have an impact on production. The growing challenges of climate change, increased international trade, and the emergence of new diseases are putting pressure on the Canadian animal health industry to both safeguard the health of our flocks and herds while still continuing to innovate and adapt to remain competitive in the global market. The industry also faces many other challenges, including its small size, representing just 10% of U.S. animal health sales and only 2.5% of the global animal health market. Given the substantially smaller size of our national flocks and herds, Canada is a lower-tier commercial market for veterinary medicines, offering a lower return on investment than other jurisdictions. A Canadian regulatory environment which does not adequately align with those of major animal health markets like the United States and the EU makes veterinary product development, introduction, and maintenance in Canada increasingly difficult. When this lack of alignment is then paired with steep increases of up to 500% in regulatory fees for the licensing of veterinary pharmaceuticals, the result is both a loss of existing products from the market and a significant impediment to the entry of new innovative products onto that market. We are already seeing the effects of this with a dramatic 40% decrease in the availability of licensed veterinary drugs on the Canadian market over the past 5 years. COVID-19 highlighted for us the importance of drug and vaccine availability in Canada. Animal health, however, was out of the spotlight of direct pandemic response, and disruptions to international veterinary supply chains received little attention. Consequently, we have increased vulnerabilities in the system now, yet veterinary supply chain disruptions are consistently deemed to be a lower priority, despite the significant risks they pose to animal health, welfare, and biosecurity. Those vulnerabilities are at risk of being further exacerbated by other government policies, such as those currently being developed to regulate those so-called forever chemicals, or per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. PFAS are used in a wide range of products and industries, with active ingredients in drugs, both human and veterinary, accounting for about 5% of the total notified uses of PFAS since 1994. In the animal health industry, PFAS are found not only in veterinary drugs, but also in other medicines, in medical equipment such as catheters and surgical devices, and personal protective equipment such as masks and gloves. They're also used in the production of pesticides and animal feed, and are key components in manufacturing equipment, consumables, drug delivery devices, and packaging. Earlier this year, the federal government released a draft State of PFAS report for consultation, which set out the rationale for a class-wide ban on the use of all PFAS in Canada. A growing number of jurisdictions, including the EU and some states in the United States, are addressing or proposing to address PFAS broadly as a class. And all those who've tackled that problem by implementing class-wide bans have also recognized the need to identify exemptions for essential or non-avoidable uses of PFAS, either at the outset of such initiatives or subsequent to their implementation of bans that prove to have unintended consequences. PFAS used in veterinary medicines need to be exempted as essential and or unavoidable uses in any Canadian regulation going forward. Canada's animal health industry plays a key role in biosecurity preparedness by providing the veterinary medicines that veterinarians and producers need to prevent, treat, and control disease outbreaks. But bringing products to market is just the first step, and the ability to maintain products on the market once they are registered here needs to be taken into consideration as the Canadian government looks to the future. If we are successfully going to prepare for and navigate emerging disease threats, ensuring the availability of veterinary medicines needs to become a government priority. We look forward to working with the federal government departments more closely in order to tackle the growing challenges that the animal health industry faces in Canada. And I thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for the opportunity to put the animal health industry's perspectives on biosecurity preparedness before you today.
Ms. Falaisky. Finalement, nous avons...
And now we have Mr. Pelletier for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm here to speak on behalf of the Fédération des producteurs d'œufs du Québec. I will do my presentation in French, but I can answer questions in both languages. So the Federation represents 199 egg producers and 108 pullet growers whose farms are spread across Quebec. The Quebec flock totals nearly 6 million laying hens, and annual production totals more than 1.8 billion eggs, a volume that meets the demand of Quebec consumers. If egg producers can meet consumer demand on an ongoing basis, it is because the sector has been able to maintain a high health status of its poultry. Quality, biosecurity, and production standards have always been a priority for producers. Over the years, very precise and strict rules have been established regarding the production and conservation of eggs on the farm. There are also programs that have been developed to control certain pathogens, for example, salmonella, which can cause food intoxication. That was done thanks to collaboration between the Quebec Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Food. Various diseases can affect poultry. Some have more impact than others, and each requires a suitable strategy for its control or eradication. To prevent and manage the diseases representing the greatest threats to the economic health of the sector, including, in Quebec, all main partners in the poultry industry came together to create a group called the Équipe québécoise de contrôle des maladies avicoles, which has been active since 2004 in order to work with the government authorities and stakeholders in case that there is the emergence of avian influenza. It is currently being developed and also, or rather it is implemented now. And it can also intervene when there are other diseases that might affect that might have an economic impact, such as infectious laryngotracheitis and Mycoplasma gallisepticum. In its primary mandate of disease prevention in the sector, biosecurity protocols were developed, which are a foundation for the collective work of producers and stakeholders in Quebec. We are right now reviewing these protocols and developing training information and material. Since 2022, however, we've been facing a strain that is highly pathogenic of avian influenza. To date, Canada has experienced 330 cases with losses of nearly 8 million poultry. Quebec has seen 47 cases over the last 2 years and 20 flocks under quota production. We only had 2 cases of avian influenza among producers who are members of the Federation. The CFIA has responsibility and legal intervention authority for the eradication of this disease, which has cost Canadian taxpayers more than $200 million to date. However, the industry partners also have a vital role in the intervention process for the eradication of the disease. And in Quebec, this shared responsibility is coordinated through the EQCMA structure. The mobilization of CFIA resources has been pushed to its limit over the past 2 years, and it has therefore called on the industry in recent months to assume a greater share of responsibility in response activities. The Federation and its EQCMA partners have worked together to find solutions at several levels, including the depopulation of infected flocks, the disposal of the dead birds, and the identification of specialized external suppliers. Faced with the scale of the challenges, particularly for the rapid depopulation of infected flocks, EQCMA is investigating new technologies for rapid and humane depopulation. In some cases, such technologies require significant investments. EQCMA appreciates the contribution that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has just granted it for this purpose. However, we would like to see the establishment of a specific fund, as was the case for the preparation against African swine fever, in order to help the sector better equip itself in Quebec and in Canada in order to deal with avian influenza, which will likely remain a significant threat for several years. Thank you for the invitation to appear before this committee. I am available to answer your questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pelletier. Now, we are moving on to the question period. To start, Mr. Liu for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here this afternoon. Mr. Pelletier, I will start with you. Quick question. You said that there were many losses over the last 2 years. The question about the current program, we know that euthanasia is covered, and disposing of the infected carcasses as well is included. With regards to the producers, are there any measures to compensate them? Of course, this is expensive for producers, and they need the funds before they euthanize their birds. Right now, the CFIA does compensate for euthanasia. The cost for the disposal of carcasses, well, one thing that is not covered is the disinfection of the site. In Quebec, there is an insurance that was put in place to help producers and to compensate them. Over the last 2 years, however, that insurance system was, however, going through many challenges because of the difficulties. Thank you. Dr. Catherine, a question for you. You talked about the importance of vaccines and the development of such vaccines. We know that there are many new strains that are currently coming about. Do you think that there is a lack of resources? The private sector is making certain contributions, but can they be more involved in supporting the development of new vaccines, especially with regards to speed and rapidity, if you will? And I will ask a question with regards to the priority of the government. If I understood what you said that there wasn't much with regards to what the government's contribution. So what should the government contribute?
So to answer the first question, certainly the development of new vaccines is a large portion of sort of what the private sector does in terms of research and innovation. That said, Canada is a market that depends pretty much exclusively on the development of vaccines in the larger markets and their production in those larger markets. So similarly to what we found with COVID vaccines during the pandemic, whereby we don't have a lot of domestic production facilities. We have some for autogenous vaccines in the veterinary sector, but we are highly dependent on the import of the vast majority of veterinary vaccines that we use. And as a result, the Canadian voice at the table in terms of determining what vaccines are developed is usually subordinate to those of the larger markets. And that's another challenge that we face in general as an industry here. Certainly, the global nature of diseases right now and the global spread of diseases works to a certain extent in our favor in terms of Canadian priorities are shared by those of the United States south of the border. But it's difficult, I think, sometimes to ensure that our voice is heard appropriately and that our needs are met with respect to that. The second question that you had in terms of priorities, I think what industry worries about is that we often have challenges in terms of identifying the availability of veterinary drugs and vaccines, which are regulated by Health Canada, and we are therefore always competing against the importance of availability of human drugs and vaccines, and rightly so. However, it can be very difficult to prioritize the availability of the veterinary drugs when it means that we may have to be pulling resources from activities geared towards ensuring that there are infant flu vaccines on the shelves in pharmacies as well. So I think anything that we can do in terms of bringing government attention to the priority that needs to be given to veterinary drugs and vaccines as a way of ensuring that we are protecting the health of our livestock in this country and therefore our trade interests is always beneficial.
Merci, docteur. Quand vous avez mentionné les priorités.
You mentioned the government's priorities. Yes, we're aware of that, but is there really a well-defined plan in place to face eventual pandemics? Are we sure that we have the resources necessary? Because we saw in the previous years we had trouble with avian flu, but it could happen elsewhere as well.
Certainly, I think there's certainly a large push right now to look at the development of a foot and mouth disease vaccine bank, specifically one that is domestic to Canada and not just the one that is shared across sort of North America. So there are priorities around that, and I think there is some work. However, we're also dealing to a certain extent with case by case. So foot and mouth disease is one, but African swine fever is another story entirely, where we don't have vaccine candidates right now. Avian flu is again handled differently. So I think it looking at a more comprehensive approach and not necessarily just a hazard by hazard approach in terms of specific diseases, but I think looking at the issue of availability of vaccines and drugs cohesively as an industry and as a nation would be beneficial, I think, to every disease that we might possibly be looking at in the future.
Merci, doctor.
Thank you, Doctor. A quick question for Mr. Vaillancourt. You talked about digitization, centralizing information, data, and so on. You said that there has to be a lot of work done on that end. What would be your recommendation to the Canadian government to improve the sharing of information? Essentially, we would need that for officials to come to an agreement with every province. There needs to be a provincial laboratory system in order to better digitize information, share that information, and access that data quickly. We have to come to an agreement, and once that's done, there's a lot of work that's going to be done to put that in place. With regards to the sales, vets can benefit from having access to those banks with different sequences and strains, but there needs to be more leadership from the industry end in order to encourage that and favor that. Thank you, Mr. Vaillancourt, and thank you, Mr. Lehoux.
I probably should have said this off the top. We're a little bit tight on time. I propose we just do 6 minutes for each party. If you have any very last-minute burning questions, we can allow a little bit of discretion. But I'll warn my parties moving forward. So to my Liberal colleagues, split your time accordingly. We'll go over to you, Mr. Drouin, for 6 minutes.
And I will be splitting my time with the good member of Parliament from Malpec. Je poserai ma première question.
My first question is for Mr. Vaillancourt. You talked about zoonotic diseases and the lack of research and collaboration in Canada vis-a-vis other jurisdictions. How do the other jurisdictions do that collaborate with regards to zoonotic disease research and everything that comes with it? Here's what I was talking about. When there is a zoonotic disease, And there are various variants in Canada that have the capacity to develop into zoonotic diseases. It hasn't happened yet, but it's possible. If the virus is not zoonotic, then the CFIA is at the front line and working with breeders. But if we realize that that disease or virus, rather, can make people sick, then public health will intervene. And of course, that's a good thing, but they are more accustomed to managing problems with regards to cities, for example, than rural areas that have various sectors. They might have to make decisions that can make things worse from a public health perspective. I can give you some examples. They are people with a lot of goodwill that are very competent, but with regards to public health, for example, H1N1, public health officials in Quebec wanted all employees to have an N95 mask that was fitted to their faces. That shows that, in my opinion, they don't really understand the risk level of contact between animals and the employees. There is a lot to do with regards to collaboration and to better communicate with them. So we have to encourage that. Thank you for your comment.
Talked about the availability of vet drugs in Canada and Health Canada perhaps needing more resources. Is that something you're hearing from those who manufacture drugs, are saying there's not enough resources at Health Canada to approve drugs in Canada, or just do the reevaluation right now? Is that?
So I think the one that we hear most often has to do with drugs that are currently on the market. So Health Canada has performance standards that it needs to meet in terms of review of current submissions for new drugs. And they have the division of Health Canada that's responsible for that has a veterinary-specific directorate, the Veterinary Drugs Directorate. When we are talking about trying to either make label changes or approve foreign sites for manufacture, we're dealing with a different branch of Health Canada, and it's the Regulatory and Operations branch, and they do not have a veterinary-specific team. So in that case, we're competing against the needs of the human veterinary, the human pharmaceutical world. I think, in general, the review times for Canada, with respect to what they are in the United States, are longer. And that makes things like joint reviews of new drugs difficult, because the U.S. is not willing to wait for Canada to go through its entire sort of review process. And as a result, products will either hit the market in the United States first, or they just won't come to Canada at all, because it's additional time and additional resources that are just not worth the return on investment in terms of market size.
Thank you.
Dr. Flesky, just a quick question just based on the conversation you just had with Member Drouin. Relevant to, are the drugs you're talking about, are these new drugs, or are they existing drugs that are being used in the United States presently?
So new drug submissions are one thing, and that's what the Veterinary Drugs Directorate deals with. The other part that we face challenges with is keeping the drugs that we have registered on the market here, and that's what the Regulatory Operations and Enforcement Branch deals with. In terms of trying to bring drugs to market here that are already on the market in the United States, we don't have the ability to have any kind of joint reviews, nor do we have the ability to essentially grandfather in or recognize foreign approvals by the USDA or the European Medicines Agency that would be really beneficial in terms of both cutting down the time that it takes to register something that's already registered somewhere else, and probably also the costs that would be associated with doing a complete review of something that regulatory authorities that we consider to be trusted regulators have already done.
A quick question. Did this kind of was it expedited by COVID-19 relevant to animal health and human health on the drugs and vaccine side?
Expedited in terms of delays, you mean, or it didn't help? We certainly saw sort of backups in the veterinary supply chains that we were also seeing on the human end of things. And there's been a bit of a perfect storm of factors over the last 5 years that the pandemic certainly contributed to.
Thank you. I'm going to switch to Dr. Vaillancourt. I just wanted to, the previous panel we talked about having disparity across the country relevant to several things inside of biosecurity. And you mentioned something about regional difference in your preamble. I was just wondering if you could expand on what you think, and you mentioned the industry, but you also likely mentioned governments, local governments. Can you expand on what you were kind of identifying there that may be an issue?
Well, okay, there's different things going on depending on the species, but essentially, for example, in Quebec right now, we've had several swine farms that have been transformed into duck farms. And that's being done by whoever has the means of doing it. And there's no consideration for is it wise to do it in this particular place, for example. So we've had situations where you have swine duck farms now that are very close to egg layers, turkey farms, and it has resulted in more cases in Quebec for high pat AI, as an example. So there is no these people can build a new farm, a new barn within 100 meters of an existing farm. As long as they respect the regulations for water table and all that, there is no consideration for the risk that it represents to build a new facility so close to another one. So that's problematic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weingor. Mr. McDonald, we'll now, maintenant, pour les blocs québécois.
Now on to the Bloc Québécois. Mr. Perron for 6 minutes. Inaudible for the interpreter. I will start with Mr. Pelletier. You talked about a specific fund for the avian flu. Can you elaborate on that? What is your recommendation? Well, as they did with African swine flu, Canada had allocated more than $20 million, $23.4 million, which was available or will be available until 2025. That should help Canadian farmers be ready if there is an African swine flu outbreak, so it helps with regards to equipment and structural elements. The avian influenza cases have brought farmers to wanting to be better prepared, and that's what the recommendation is. So you think that there should be, so what you're suggesting or recommending is a similar fund. Here's something else that you brought up, the compensation for the value of the birds, but not for cleaning or disinfection. Is that a recommendation you'd make? How are producers experiencing this abandonment, if you will? Well, historically, the government has never compensated for that. In the United States, the federal government compensates for the farmer for cleaning and disinfection. And since there is no such thing, here, Quebec was inspired to set up a fund, but not all producers adhere to that or adhere to the program. So more money allocated to that in the fund would be appreciated. Thank you. Mr. Vaillancourt, you recommended many things. You talked about standards for new constructions. If I understand correctly, you say that we should regulate the fact that, or rather, there should be regulation so that there aren't too many buildings built close to one another to avoid contamination. But so I suppose that you're but with regards to supply management, they wouldn't be too close together. So maybe there should be a determined amount of space. What are you recommending? Well, in Italy, they consider 4 or 5 factors or risk factors, and those are always taken into consideration when they are building a new farm, and that includes the distance with regards to new sites. So in Italy, if they want to build a new farm, they can't do that in a space that is smaller than 2 kilometers. For different kinds of buildings, it can go a little bit further. So it really depends on the type of production, on the type of animal, for example. But there is data in scientific literature on this. When you talk about transfers from geese to pork, for example, it's just that you don't know if this production is going to change. And other productions might have the same risks. Did I understand you correctly? In Quebec, we created a situation. There were people on hog farms that eliminated their hog production. They still want to use their building, which is understandable. And you could do that in any which way. The problem right now is that we've realized that this contributed to the outbreak, or to the number of buildings that we had. When you talk about with regards to data, you're talking about having it Canada-wide. Yes, of course, but it doesn't have to include all of the diseases. We have to select the diseases that are most important for various producers. Dr. Fileski, you say that Canada is too small a market for vaccine and medication producers. I understand, but how do you manage that? Do our agencies not have enough money to evaluate the medication that is available elsewhere? Or should we not be investing in research and development? Whatever your solutions may be.
I think the biggest thing that we can do in terms of making the Canadian market more attractive in terms of bringing products here has to do with better aligning our regulatory requirements for both new products and existing products with those of the large markets, particularly the United States and the European Union. I think better use and more effective use of foreign decisions in terms of licensing of products by regulatory authorities that we consider to be trusted, and there is a core group of those. There are 5 of them. They collaborate a lot.
Excusez de vous couper, les PFAS, vous trouvez qu'il faut qu'on réglemente rapidement?
I'm sorry to cut you off. The PFAS, you think that we should be regulating them quickly?
Miss Fileski. No. I gave all the other parties another extra minute, so don't worry about trying to get it in 15 seconds. Vous avez une minute.
You have 1 minute. For PFAS? Okay. Yeah. So we share the concern in terms of environmental contamination and all of sort of the issues that surround PFAS. What I think we are trying to be very cautious of is to build on the experience of other jurisdictions who've already gone down the road of doing a class-wide ban using an extremely broad definition of what a PFA is, and have those implementations of bans having been walked back because they then realized that all of a sudden you were not going to have inhalational anesthetics. You are all of a sudden not going to have certain nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories because these compounds now fell into this very broad definition. So I think looking at the experience of other jurisdictions, taking into consideration very carefully how we define PFAs and what the rationale is, and making sure also, I think, that all of our drugs and all of the packaging that we use in our drugs have to go through very rigorous regulatory requirements as it is, which includes their management throughout their life cycle, right from product inception right through to disposal of remaining product and packaging. So I think when we look at developing PFAS regulations in this country, we need to be very careful, I think, that we don't have unintended consequences from those bans that will then essentially really curtail our ability to have access to products, both human and veterinary, with respect to drugs and vaccines.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Fileski.
Thank you, Ms. Fileski and Mr. Perron. On to Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes.
You do need a slight extra, Mr. McGregor. I can give it to you. Go ahead.
How very generous, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Dr. Vaillancourt, I'd like to turn to you, and apologies if you've covered this in previous answers, but I just want to make sure that for my sake and for this eventual committee report that we're getting some clarity. So I think you have looked at the effect of surveillance cameras on biosecurity protocols on farms, and I think you've concluded that those methods did fail to improve long-term compliance. I was taking a few notes during your opening statement, and you had talked about the need for investment in technology to ensure compliance. And you may have heard in the first hour, I was asking the CFA about the voluntary protocols in place, how we learn from previous mistakes, how we ensure compliance in the future. So can you, just as part of my first question, that technology, what technology are you specifically referring to other than surveillance cameras? Can you just delve into that a little bit more deeply for me, please?
Yeah, well, briefly, we can use sensors, for example, that have microchips essentially in the boots, so that if people do not change their boots when they need to go from one zone to another zone in the entry room, essentially it will be detected. If they do not activate the Purell dispenser to clean their hands, that can also be recorded and be associated to them, because to get in, they could have like a magnetic card so that they can identify themselves. So we have ways of gathering data, using that information to then do training to improve compliance. You could go and say, it's mandatory, you need to have this or to have that, but we're dealing with human beings, human nature. So you need to work at technologies that are like human nature proof. Okay, I didn't say idiot proof, but human nature proof. And using sensors is one good way to go.
And I guess it would almost certainly aid the CFIA in an after the fact investigation. If they're trying to trace how a disease outbreak happened, that data would be very helpful. And we may not be in favor of making these compliance rules mandatory, but I guess what would you like to see as a follow-up to that important data gathering? Like how do we ensure compliance from the lessons learned from the use, the hopefully widespread use of that technology?
Well, yeah, I mentioned technology at the farm per se, but we already have companies that can use sensors. So, and they have like geofencing around sites, and people have an application on their phone. And when they get in, we know who they are when they're coming in, the risk they may represent, and all that. So we need to look into this because we're looking at big data here. But if we do it properly, it could be, of course, very confidential. We need to respect that because growers would be very concerned if you have like Big Brother gathering information like this. But it can be done with them basically in control of having that information and using it for regional biosecurity. Because you cannot just biosecure each farm one at a time. You need to look at it at a regional level.
To make. You had also, in exchanges with colleagues in previous interventions, you've talked about how, when establishing a new farm, you have to take care to pay attention to the distance between a new farm and an existing one. But I want to turn to the subject of backyard flocks, because in my neck of the woods, it's a very rural area, and people love keeping chickens. They love being able to go out every morning and collecting their eggs. People feel very strongly attached to that farming practice. They feel it's a very important part of our local food security. So how do you envisage those two worlds living side by side, where we are both paying attention to the very real biosecurity concerns that may be present from backyard flocks, especially with avian influenza, and also trying to make sure that people's sense of food security and providing for their own families is also not disturbed? What could we reasonably do to alleviate those problems?
Well, the first thing is that people with backyard flocks, they tend not to be to look at the commercial operations as being necessarily friendly because they look at them often as the bad guys. So there's a place here for provincial and possibly federal, governments to come in and even the municipal government to come in and help. And what I'm talking about here is to register these backyard flocks. You have to register your dog. Your dog, you need to prove that it's got a rabies vaccine, it's got its medal and all that. Well, why not backyard flocks demonstrating that they got vaccinated for different pathogens and for providing, if we know where they are, who they are, then we can provide information to improve the health of these backyard flocks. Because you're right, they're there, they're never going to disappear. And the research has shown, if there's not an epidemiological link, like somebody working in the backyard flock and then going straight into a commercial barn, it's not that big of a risk per se. But they are a reservoir. So there's a place for the government there.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGregor. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses. We appreciate your testimony. We are going to go in camera for a couple of minutes, colleagues, so we'll excuse our witnesses. Those of you who are online, you're free to go, and thanks again. Just stick around for a couple of minutes.
Thank you.